In the 1650s, a Caribbean island, smaller than the city of Houston, became more valuable to the British Empire than every single one of its North American colonies combined. Not gold, not tobacco, not even close, sugar. By the time you finish the coffee in your hand right now, you will have touched a substance that financed wars, built palaces in London, doubled the size of the United States, and condemned 12.5 million human beings to the most brutal forced labor system in modern history. This is the real, uncut history of sugar, and by the end of this, you are going to look at the bowl on your kitchen counter completely differently. 10,000 years ago, in the jungle lowlands of New Guinea, something was growing wild that no human tongue had ever registered before. A tall, fibrous grass, thick stalks, packed with juice. Indigenous islanders pulled it from the ground, bit straight into the fiber, and tasted pure, concentrated sweetness for the first time in human history. Raw sugarcane, no refining, no trade. Just people chewing on a stalk for the sugar rush, generation after generation, as the plant slowly drifted across the Pacific through migration and early island-hopping trade. By 3500 BC, it had reached India, and that is where the plant stopped being a snack and became a weapon of economics. Indian farmers worked out something nobody else on Earth had figured out yet. Crush the cane, boil the juice, let it crystallize into a hard, transportable solid. They called it kanda. It is the root of the English word candy. For the first time, sweetness could survive a journey. India had just invented sugar as a product instead of a plant, and ancient physicians started prescribing it for headaches, stomach disorders, even impotence. Sanskrit medical texts from this period describe sugar with something close to reverence, listing it alongside ghee and honey as one of the great gifts of the natural world. Temples used it in religious offerings. Wealthy households stockpiled it the way modern families stockpile gold jewelry, passed down through generations as a store of value, not just a food. Sugar was not a snack. Sugar was sacred. By the time Chinese Buddhist monks traveled through India in the 7th century, they were writing home describing sugar production techniques as one of the great technological marvels they had witnessed on their journey, on par with anything else India had to offer the world. In 326 BC, Alexander the Great's army marched into India, and his soldiers came home with a story nobody back in Greece quite believed. One of his officers, a man named Nearchus, described a reed that produced honey with no bees involved at all. The Greeks thought it sounded like a traveler's tall tale. Sweetness, out of a grass, growing in dirt? For centuries, that is exactly what it remained in the West. Roman curiosity. By the time it reached Roman pharmacies, a single pound cost an ordinary laborer a full month's wages. Sugar was not food in Rome. It was medicine, locked behind apothecary counters, measured out by the spoonful for stomach pain and eye infections. It stayed locked away in Europe for almost 1,000 years. Then Arab chemists cracked the code. Between the 7th and 13th centuries, scholars across Persia, Egypt, and North Africa perfected sugar refining into something whiter, purer, and longer-lasting than anything India had ever produced. They built mills across 3 continents. They planted cane wherever the climate cooperated. They turned sugar into a traded global good. By 1096, when European crusaders reached the Levant, sugar was already stitched into Middle Eastern medicine and cooking. The crusaders tasted it and completely lost their minds over it. Knights carried sugar home next to their swords and holy relics. Venice, sitting at the crossroads of East and West, became Europe's sugar gateway into importing raw cane, refining it, and reselling it at brutal markups for 200 straight years. In medieval Europe, sugar got treated the way we treat gold bars today. Kings displayed sugar sculptures at royal banquets as a flex of pure wealth. At Henry III's wedding feast in 1236, the English royal household bought over 300 pounds of sugar for a single event, worth more than a knight's entire yearly income. If you could afford sugar, you were somebody. If you could not, there is a real chance you went your entire life without tasting it once. So here is a question worth sitting with for a second. If sugar was this valuable, why did Europe not just grow its own? Because it could not. Sugarcane needs tropical heat. You cannot grow it in England, France, or anywhere in Scandinavia. European demand was exploding, and the only supply chain ran straight through the Islamic world, a route that was expensive, fragile, and politically volatile. So in the 1400s, Portugal started colonizing islands out in the Atlantic. Madeira, the Canaries, São Tomé, off the coast of Africa, and found the one thing Europe never had. They need tropical heat, sitting inside their own empire. They needed labor to work it. First they tried convicts, then poor European laborers. Neither lasted. Sugar cultivation is brutal, dictate 18 to 20 hours of back-breaking labor a day during harvest, in extreme heat, with workers collapsing from exhaustion, injury, and disease. So Portugal turned to enslaved Africans instead. The plantations of São Tomé became the prototype, the first working model for what would become the most horrific labor system in modern history. In 1492, on his second voyage, Columbus carried sugarcane cuttings across the Atlantic in the cargo hold. The Caribbean climate was perfect. The soil was perfect. European appetite was bottomless. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Making sugar was a factory of mutilation long before factories existed. Cane had to be cut by hand with machetes in tropical heat, then fed into grinding mills within hours before the juice spoiled in the heat. Workers feeding cane into the rollers risked losing fingers, hands, entire arms pulled in at the wrist. Plantation owners kept hatchets mounted next to the machines, specifically so a trapped limb could be severed in seconds before the rollers dragged the rest of the body through. After grinding, the juice went into copper kettles over open fires, in boiling houses that regularly topped 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns from splashing molten sugar were not occasional accidents. They were a daily certainty. The work never stopped, day or night, for the entire harvest season. What followed was an Atlantic-wide land grab. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all raced to plant sugar colonies. Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, Brazil. By the 1650s, tiny Barbados was outproducing the entire colony of Brazil and had become the single most valuable possession in the British Empire. Now here is the number that should stop you cold. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, roughly 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced onto ships across the Atlantic. A massive share of them were funneled straight into sugar. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar plantation was 7 years after arrival. 7 years. Plantation owners ran the math and decided it was cheaper to work people to death and simply purchase replacements than to keep anyone alive with humane conditions. This is the part that should make you angry. Sugar did not just benefit from slavery. Sugar drove slavery. It was the financial engine that made the entire transatlantic slave trade profitable enough to sustain for 300 years. If this is the part of history nobody taught you in school, hit subscribe right now. We dig up stories exactly like this every week. And what happens next involves a debt so cruel it is still being repaid today. Sugar plantations created something the colonial powers never planned for: resistance. On the French colony of Saint-Domingue, what we now call Haiti, enslaved sugar workers launched the only successful large-scale slave revolt in human history. In 1791, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people rose up, burned the plantations to ash, and fought a 12-year war against the French, the Spanish, and the British, all at once. By 1804, they had won. Haiti became the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere, born directly out of sugarcane fields and ashes. But here is the part most people never hear, because France did not let it go quietly. In 1825, the French king sent warships back to Haiti and informed the new nation that its independence would cost something. France demanded payment for the property it claimed to have lost. That property was the formerly enslaved people themselves. Haiti agreed to pay roughly 90 million gold francs. Today, that is somewhere north of $20 billion. It took until 1947 to finish paying it off. For over a century, the first nation built by formerly enslaved people spent its national income buying back its own freedom from the country that enslaved it. And the shockwaves did not stop there. Losing Haiti's sugar revenue wrecked Napoleon's entire American ambition. Holding the rest of his territory on the continent no longer made financial sense without it. So in 1803, he sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for roughly $15 million, about 4 cents an acre. Sugar's collapse in one Caribbean colony quietly doubled the size of the United States. Britain's navy had also blockaded French ports, cutting Napoleon off from Caribbean cane entirely. So he pivoted to sugar beets, a temperate European crop carrying the exact same sucrose, identified decades earlier by a German chemist named Andreas Marggraf. Napoleon threw the state's money behind it. Cash bounties for farmers who converted their fields. Entire research institutes built for one purpose. By 1813, France was producing millions of pounds of beet sugar a year, a monopoly that had survived thousands of years, broken inside a single decade. By 1700, the average English person ate about 4 pounds of sugar a year. By 1800, that number had jumped to 18. That was not an accident of taste. British merchants and politicians actively pushed sugar consumption because the colonies producing it were making them obscenely wealthy. Parliament even lowered tariffs on sugar imports for one specific reason: to keep factory workers fed, caffeinated, and moving on the cheap. Tea on its own is bitter. Sugar made it palatable enough for working-class taste, and sugar delivered something factory life desperately needed: fast, cheap calories. A worker pulling a 12 to 14-hour shift could not afford a real meal break. A cup of sweet tea and a jam sandwich kept the machine running without the cost of feeding anyone properly. Sugar had stopped being a luxury. It had become industrial fuel, and the British Empire ran on it. This is where the so-called triangle trade locked into place. Manufactured goods sailed from Europe down to West Africa. Enslaved people were forced from Africa across to the Caribbean. Sugar sailed from the Caribbean back to Europe, where it funded the next round of manufactured goods. Every single corner of that triangle ran on sugar money. The ships that carried enslaved people were often the exact same ships that carried sugar home on the return voyage. London bankers financed both legs of the journey, and they rarely distinguished between the two kinds of cargo on their balance sheets. By 1750, Britain was importing more sugar than every other commodity combined, including the tobacco and cotton everyone assumes dominated colonial trade. That appetite crossed the Atlantic and exploded. The Coca-Cola Company launched in 1886. Within decades, it was selling millions of bottles a year, each one loaded with sugar. Candy bars hit shelves. Breakfast cereal went from plain oats to sugar-coated novelty, marketed straight at children. By 1970, the average American was consuming over 100 pounds of sugar a year. 100 pounds, roughly the weight of a large dog, consumed in pure sugar by every single man, woman, and child in the country every single year. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. By the 1950s, internal research inside major sugar companies already showed a strong, documented link between sugar and heart disease. They buried it. In 1967, the Sugar Research Foundation paid 3 Harvard scientists, the equivalent of roughly $50,000 in today's money, to publish a study that blamed heart disease on dietary fat instead, while quietly downplaying sugar's role. It ran in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most trusted medical journals on the planet, and it shaped nutrition policy in this country for the next 30 years. This is the part that should make you angry. Food companies stripped fat out of their products and replaced it with sugar to keep the flavor intact. The result was an explosion of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease that has gone on to kill millions of people. The sugar industry had the data the entire time. They chose profit over public health. and the public paid for that decision with their bodies. The cover-up finally cracked open in 2016, when researchers at the University of California, San Francisco, uncovered the internal company documents proving exactly what had happened. It was the tobacco industry's playbook, copied almost word for word and applied to food. Create doubt, fund friendly research, attack the critics, delay regulation for as long as humanly possible. While that cover-up was unraveling, a different sweetener was quietly taking over the entire American food supply, with almost no public conversation about it at all. In the early 1970s, Japanese scientists worked out how to convert cornstarch into a cheap liquid sweetener, or high-fructose corn syrup. American corn farmers were already overproducing, thanks to decades of government subsidies designed to keep corn prices artificially low. High-fructose corn syrup gave that surplus a brand new market to absorb. By 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi had switched their entire American product lines over. It was cheaper than cane sugar, easier to ship in liquid form, and blended more smoothly into processed food. Within a decade, it had replaced cane sugar in almost every packaged product in the country. Here is the part that ties it all together. Federal farm policy in the 1970s actively rewarded farmers for growing more corn than the market could possibly use, regardless of price. Surplus corn needed somewhere to go, and high-fructose corn syrup gave an entire industry a built-in customer for grain nobody was eating directly. It is the rare case in history where a government subsidy and a food company's bottom line pointed in the exact same direction, and the American public's blood sugar paid the difference. Most Americans never even noticed the switch happened. Today, the average American eats about 17 teaspoons of added sugar a day. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 6 for women, 9 for men. We are running at 2 to 3 times the recommended limit, and a huge chunk of it is hiding in places nobody thinks to check. Pasta sauce, bread, salad dressing, flavored yogurt, a single can of regular soda packs, about 10 teaspoons of sugar, more than your entire recommended daily limit, sitting in one 12-ounce can. The global numbers back this up at a terrifying scale. Over 42% of American adults are now classified as obese. 37 million Americans live with diabetes. Another 96 million sit at pre-diabetic levels, one bad decade away from joining them. Worldwide sugar production now tops 180 million tons a year. Brazil leads production, followed closely by India, the same country that invented sugar crystallization 3,500 years ago and is still in the business today. Some governments are finally pushing back. Mexico's soda tax in 2014 cut consumption by about 12% in its first year alone. The UK's sugar levy in 2018 forced manufacturers to reformulate their drinks before the tax even took effect. Berkeley, Philadelphia, and Seattle have all passed their own local sugar taxes, and the sugar industry has poured millions of dollars into fighting every single one of them, in every single city. Sugar's story runs 10,000 years deep across 6 continents. It was there when empires rose. It was there when millions were enslaved, when a nation was forced to pay for its own freedom for over a century. It was there when revolutions erupted, when colonies collapsed, when the Industrial Revolution remade the entire world from the ground up. A 10,000-year-old jungle grass from New Guinea became the single most consequential crop in human history. It built fortunes. It financed empires. It also buried the truth about its own damage for 50 straight years. Think about everything that one plant touched. A war that doubled the size of the United States. A nation that paid for its own freedom for over 100 years. A medical journal that printed a lie for 3 decades. A government subsidy that quietly rewired what an entire country eats for breakfast. None of that happened because sugar is evil. It happened because sugar is profitable, and profit has a way of outrunning the truth if nobody is watching closely enough. And right now, it is sitting in your kitchen, in your cereal, in your ketchup, in your bread, waiting to be noticed. Before you scroll on, take a guess. Out of everything in this video, which number do you think most people get wrong? The 7 years enslaved workers survived, the $20 billion debt Haiti paid for its own freedom, or the 50 years the sugar industry hid the truth? Drop your guess in the comments, hit subscribe, and I will pin the most interesting answers. We have got a lot more hidden histories like this one coming.